Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe, and this is the Joe Martino Show. Today, I am excited to share with you an interview that I did with a colleague and actually former professor, Catherine Mueller Bell. There's more of an introduction for her in the interview that I'll get into. The interview, we're talking about a book that she is currently writing about disciplining our children. I do want to make every listener aware she does come from a very specific point of view, and some people will at least relate to the broader scope of that. Some people will not. In other words, if you are kind of anti-religion, you may not share her starting point. And yet you might find the interview fascinating, and I hope that you do. As always, interviewees' opinions are their own and should not be construed as anything other than that, their opinion, where certainly though hers is an opinion that is rooted in years of research. She is a PhD holder and years of excellent practice. Also, if you want to join in the therapy process with Catherine, call our office, 616-481-3784. Let's kick it off. This is The Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to The Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
Okay, so I am here with Catherine Mueller Bell. I appreciate you joining us today. A former professor of mine for my master's in counseling, a cornerstone here in the great Midwest, and now has moved back to the East Coast to the house that you grew up in. Is that right?
That's right. I'm in the Boston area. Yes.
Right. Big Red Sox fan, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah.
Although I did see a picture the other day, your son had a Pittsburgh Pirates hoodie on. I have that exact hoodie. It warmed my heart.
And did you see his New York hat? He had a New York hat.
I did. I was very excited. What we're getting together today to talk about is your book that, as of this recording, you're in the process of a proposal for writing about spanking.
Yes.
And corporal punishment. And your view is a little bit upstream as far as it's going to take on the idea that spanking is good. Tell us a little bit about it, where you're at in the process, what's going on as far as your side of that.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be in the book proposal writing stage. This will be my first book, and so I'm almost done with the proposal, and I'll submit that at the end of April 2020 here, so I'm really excited about that. I've been wanting to write this for a long time. I graduated with my PhD in 2014, and my dissertation was about this topic.
Right. You were actually one of the first professors that I had that introduced me to scholarly books that were actually against spanking. I had read scholarly books as far as outside of a religious environment, but I think the first book you introduced me to was Spare the Rod.
Yes.
Which sits on my shelf right over there right now. Yeah, very exciting. Tell me a little bit about the responses that you typically get from people when you tell them your view of spanking. You know, a lot of times I get pushback when I talk about it. You know, I was spanked and I turned out okay, or the church has interpreted these passages this way for thousands of years. I assume you get those same types of pushback. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I do get consistent resistance to the topic or even discussing it, which really spurs me on even more because I really hope we can start to have a dialogue. And that resistance to the conversation concerns me. So the book that I'm writing, I have an audience of my evangelical brothers and sisters in mind. So I'm choosing two Christian publishers to send it to.
Okay.
And I'm hoping to break down some of that resistance to open up the conversation so that we can think critically about it and make sure we've really understood the passages from Scripture well, that we're in conversation about that and making informed decisions about such an important topic. So,
awesome. Yeah. Now, something that wasn't on the discussion list of questions that we talked about, but that I've thought about since then is you're a female, you are a professor and practitioner in a soft science, in a field, counseling, social work, that typically the church has not looked favorably upon, to be blunt.
Yeah.
How do you handle, do you get that kind of pushback when you have the conversation? You know, I find people can be somewhat dismissive of my female colleagues. How do you handle that type of resistance?
Well, first, I understand that just the history of understanding gender in a lot of evangelical communities, it's a developmental process as we try to understand who image bearers are. And so in my mind, male and female are both, we see in Genesis. And so I have
Right.
that conviction. And so I come to the conversation with confidence because of that.
Okay.
And so I really, my goal is to invite people to consider the male and female perspective, because we get closer to the image of God, we get closer to understanding the mind and heart of God, and to understand the identity of Christ. And so I actually don't find the resistance shocking as a female professional. I do understand it comes from a lot of history, and I have a lot of patience with that. But I also am very passionate about furthering the understanding of the identity of women as a strength, as an image bearer. And so my goal is to be part of that conversation, to dispel some of those myths and some of those distortions that some folks have in the evangelical community about women. And so there's a lot of female leaders that are quite godly and quite involved in not only counseling, but in theology and Bible scholarship. So I love being part of that development, and I hope that that continues development for years to come. So
Awesome.
I'm proud to be part of that.
Right. It is an exciting time. I think it's one of the things that I love about being alive today is we are at a place where at least we're having these discussions.
Yeah. Great.
Where when I was a kid, I feel like it was either you were discussions about spanking were kind of like political discussions today. You're either all the way over there or you're all the way over there.
Yeah.
There's no middle ground to find. And at least they're starting to happen, I hope. Tell me how do you, earlier when we were talking, just kind of getting ready for this, you talked about how resistance actually inspires you to a little bit more, to really want to kind of push for the conversation. How do you do that? You know, with your colleagues, with people in churches, how do you do that in a way that you find to be true to you?
Well, I think it's all about the relationship. To start by listening well to others. I try to listen. I try to approach the topic in a sensitive way, because it is such a personal topic. It conjures up all kinds of images of childhood and the need to protect parents, and sort of we can get defensive about those issues. So I try to approach it in a respectful way and listen first, and then invite people to consider whether they'd want to hear a different perspective on such an important topic like raising children, how to discipline children. And so I try to just handle it in a patient, trustworthy way. And some folks are not interested.
Right.
And some folks are. So I'm hoping through the book that it can at least create more conversation, is what I'm interested in. I'm not trying to convince anybody of, taking my view. I'm a teacher, so I want to promote diverse perspectives. But in this book, I will, for the first time, take a position that I have, which I couldn't really share in the dissertation, because in a dissertation it has to be so objective and to present the data from my sample group. So this will be the first time I take a position against using corporal punishment or spanking children in the effort to discipline them.
Right. It's interesting. My wife and I are in the process of writing a book, kind of as a attachment to the book that I wrote a couple years ago, called Raising the Emotionally Secure Child. And we're in the outlining phase. And one of the things that we talk about a lot with people is I'm not interested in punishing my children. Even from a biblical point of view, I'm interested in training them, which is a lot of discussion. It is a lot of, hey, how is what you're doing helping you become the adult that you want to be, that you've told me you want to be? And even in the room, when I deal with it with clients, there's almost always one who kind of gets hooked up on, yeah, but there's no punishment for what they did. And you can just watch the confusion in their eyes when I'm like, yeah, because I'm not interested in punishing them.
It's a
I'm
challenge.
interested in helping them. And a lot of times we meld those two words, punishment and help.
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind, tell me your most frustrating pro spanking argument.
Okay, let's
One
see.
that you hear a lot.
There are many.
Yes.
I would say, because some people will say the child is not rational at age 1 or 2, or, an infant. And so they have to have the experience of physical pain to get their attention. That's the
Oh,
first
yes.
one that
Yes.
concerns me. The second one is I turned out okay.
Yes.
So, I was spanked and I turned out okay.
Yeah.
So those
That
are
one
the
drives me
most
crazy.
popular ones.
Yes. And the other one that that I just find so frustrating is you can't reason with a child.
Yeah.
And I always say, yeah, I agree with you. You can't.
Yeah.
And the one that I spanked and I turned out okay, unfortunately, I've lost friendships over
Wow.
that, because I've actually said to them, that's not really an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And how many people would we need to find that were spanked and didn't turn out okay to sway the argument? And it's unfortunate.
Stop being defensive about it, by even just taking stock of our own lives. And we can do that in a way where we still honor our caregivers.
Yes.
We can still look at, what do we want to carry on? What do we want to leave behind? So that defensiveness worries me, because I think it's hard to make change in our life if we're so defensive and protective.
Yes.
So my goal is to just try to soften those walls of defensiveness and open up the conversation.
Yes.
Because that's how we grow, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love to do with people is just kind of present the idea.
Yeah.
And I always tell them, you don't have to agree with me,
Yeah.
but I win, air quotes, if 3 days from now you're still mulling over this conversation.
Yeah.
Even if you end up disagreeing with me, so be it.
Yeah.
Another topic on parenting that I'm very passionate about is co-sleeping. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and I told him, I said, you don't have to agree with me.
Mm-hmm.
I just hope that I've opened up dialogue for you to think about things broader than what we've walked into. I used to be the parent that was pro spanking. And as my wife challenged me on it, read some books, started to kind of like, let's look at this differently.
That's great, Joe. Wow.
So what do you say to parents who spanked their kids?
Mm-hmm.
Now their kids are adults, and the parents feel that their parenting method is being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And I find this one a lot. Like, I have a friend who's very, very adamantly pro spanking.
Mm-hmm.
And her argument is, my kids are all very successful adults.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously it worked.
Yeah.
How do you handle that conversation?
Well, I think there's different types of success, and what I like to talk to parents about is, I think it's wise as a parent of adult children, and I have two sons, for us to take stock and reflect on how we parented, and in our conversations with our adult children, admit any mistakes you think we might have made, be firm in different approaches that we took and that we felt were healthy, but to really be open to that constructive thought and constructive criticism from others, because we all make mistakes as parents. I mean, the reality, as a parent myself, we all make mistakes. So I really want to encourage the idea of some humility in the parents' mental posture when they reflect on these things with their adult kids. To maybe even say, I think I made a mistake in this area and I'm sorry.
Yes.
It's very healing. It's a very healing thing for adult children.
Yes.
So there's different types of success. Maybe they're really strong in as far as our cultural expectations of making a living and functioning as an adult, but maybe they might be challenged to be emotionally available.
Right.
And so as counselors, Joe, we look at the different domains of our humanity. And really what I'm, as a counselor, trying to help folks do is protect their humanity, their connect the head and the heart.
Right.
And so it depends on what type of success we're talking about.
Yes, I think that's a great response. It's certainly, I like to have that conversation with people. Success there has to be a broader definition than just their, successfully in their field, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that and we touched on this a little bit earlier, that I often run into is people tell me, well, you can't argue with a child. You can't reason with a child.
Yeah.
And that's why they spank.
Mm-hmm.
How do you handle that conversation? When you're talking to people, maybe, as a counselor, as an author who's about to take an opinion, express an opinion that you've already taken that is not going to be very popular. It's a little bit of, swimming upstream against the current, so to speak. How do you handle that argument? Well, you can't reason with kids.
What I first respond is children are at different developmental points, and the way we communicate with them does change as they grow older. So they're right. There's a certain point where you can't really reason, but the physical means of actually trying to teach them something could really, I think, backfires because of what happens when a child feels afraid for their physical safety. So I don't think they're really listening anymore, and they're certainly not going to be able to reason when they're feeling afraid and they're struck physically. Because all different things happen in the body and in the brain when that happens. When we think about just sort of our nervous system and how the brain functions, all of a sudden that child who maybe you're arguing can't reason, they really can't now because they're having to go into that fight or flight mode. Or freeze mode, as we're learning in the research, where they might just numb out. And so there's a whole nother level of that conversation to help parents tune in to what's happening in the cognitive domain that, of course, they're not able to reason like a 30-year-old, 40-year-old parent. But that they have the capacity to learn. They do have the capacity to learn as they are growing, no matter what age they are as a child. So we want to optimize their capacity to learn by making sure that we are providing a safe form of discipline. And I think we'd all agree children need discipline. That's not my argument. They need guidance. They need clear discipline from their parent or their caregiver. But to do it in a way that the child is receptive to and actually internalizes the reasoning, and it expands their ability to reason because they're not feeling afraid.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk a lot about is how people really spanking is the ultimate expression of intensity. Mm-hmm. And I always ask people, where do you go next? Okay, so you spank them.
Yeah.
And then if they run into an issue again, an hour later, 2 hours later, you've kind of exhausted your intensity bucket. The only thing you can do is go back and hit them harder or longer. Like there's not a lot of other options.
That's true.
And it becomes really, to me, I always ask parents, what's the goal? Is it to stop this behavior right now alone? Or is it to stop the behavior and point them towards who they're becoming?
Yes.
And, even a 30-year-old, like your son is 29. If I inflicted pain on him, well, he's a big boy, so I probably wouldn't be able to do it. But if I did, there comes a point where the brain just shuts off and you're just in that fight, flight, or freeze mode.
Yeah.
And we have to embrace that side of it. Earlier we were talking and you mentioned this, and maybe I think the listeners would appreciate this. Social science seems to be pretty settled on the topic.
Oh yeah.
That spanking is detrimental. How do you handle people? Confirmation bias, self-serving bias is a very real thing. Mm-hmm. How do you handle people who are like, oh, well, that's just because they're liberal, they're against whatever? How do you handle that conversation?
Yeah, that's a common conversation.
Yes.
The way I handle it is to then start to rely on what do Bible scholars and theologians say about this topic. Now, I stay in my lane as a counselor, as a Christian counselor, PhD level. I do stay in my lane. I don't presume to be an expert in theology and Bible, but I interview Bible scholars on this topic, and that's what I'm doing for this book. So I'll be presenting their perspective and fusing the psychological perspective. Because you're right, social scientists have addressed it, and some Christian literature has addressed it, and they have a very polarized view of this topic. I haven't seen many books written about, from a Christian evangelical point of view, about the psychological effect on the child. And there will be resistance because of the fear that science, social science, is not reliable, not trustworthy because of the bias. And what I would say is our mental health is part of our humanity from a biblical perspective. When you look at the biblical narrative and study the different parts of humanity, our emotional health is part of our identity as Christians. And so I do think we have to be cautious and leery of some theories in psychology that were born out of atheism. I think that's a good pushback. As you know, as I used to be your professor, I think critically about those theories, that there are some distortions in those theories. So I join them in that caution. But I also invite them to consider that the psychological domain is part of our human nature. As we look at the life of Jesus, as we look at different experiences in biblical times of the mental and physical and spiritual health. So I present a holistic perspective and invite people to consider that we're not just one-dimensional, that we are multidimensional as image bearers, and that sometimes will further the conversation and there's less resistance, because I'm also cautious about some of the theories in social science. So I think that that's where we find common ground. So I look for common ground for ways we can join together in the conversation, because really what I'm hoping is that folks make an informed decision, whatever they decide. And I'm presenting one view to perhaps consider other forms of raising children, disciplining children that do not involve physical means or a physical approach or any type of aggression or violence in any way.
Right. One of the things you were talking about there is the holistic approach. One of the things that, as I engage that with people, is I'll often ask them, for the sake of the argument, let's just say you're right that spanking does work. What's the cost?
Yeah.
And I find that that's not a question that as a society we've asked much.
I don't think we've asked that enough. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. And when you start having that conversation, like what's the cost? Like I could go buy a sports car right now, but I've got, 4 kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could afford it, but what's the cost?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same principle. And sometimes, like you said earlier, sometimes people want to have that conversation. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Do you have, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the price is high. You bring up a great point, Joe. I think the cost is high and the price is high. Because we think about when we're raising children, hopefully we want to raise children that are compassionate and empathic.
Yes.
To me, the quality and virtues of being empathic really lend themselves well to being an amazing citizen locally and a global citizen, to care about other.
Yes.
And I do think we are infringing on that when we start to use means that of parenting that instill fear and cause the child to go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. The freeze mode concerns me, I'd say, the most.
Sure.
That part of them that has to become numb because feeling that intense fear is just, and so that disconnect from their emotional life concerns me greatly.
Yes.
I think the cost is potentially high. That's not true for every child. They all have different temperaments, but some children are more sensitive to stimuli than others.
Yes. Yep. And what I find is one of the things when I'm working with adults, there are certain things that show up in the room, and I'll almost always know at some point now I'm going to have to bring up, hey, let me guess, one of your parents was very physical in their nature of discipline.
Yeah.
And they're always like, yeah, how do you know? I'm like, well, you see it, the connections.
Yeah.
Do you have a working title? I know eventually the publisher will pick it for you, but do you have a working title?
Well, I have about 10 that I'm proposing. In the book proposal, they ask you to come up with about 10 different potential titles. Right. So I'm not really settled on one yet. I'm very open to the feedback from the publisher. So I don't have my heart set on one.
Okay.
But I do have my heart set on the topic of presenting my opinion, because it's the first time I'm actually presenting my opinion, because like I said in the dissertation, they're not concerned with that at all.
Right.
Yeah. So
as you do that and as you embrace this conversation, is there a concern of yours that people are going to kind of freeze you out at all? Earlier we were talking, my wife and I do parenting conferences, and I actually had somebody for a long time, they just wouldn't pull the trigger and I couldn't understand why. And it was all about the spanking.
Yeah.
Which is really about an hour of the conference, an 8-hour conference. That's about one hour of it. do you have, like, how are you processing that for your own self, right? I mean, we all have a view of what we'd like the world to treat us like.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel ready for that resistance. I feel ready for the rejection that it'll bring, because that's part of it, you know?
Yes.
And so to me, it's worth it to invite the people that are interested in the conversation. And for those that are resistant, just to plant a seed would mean a lot, and to develop those relationships. So I don't worry about being sort of rejected or sort of blacklisted from certain things, because I feel called to write this spiritually. So
Sure.
it's sort of beyond, it's bigger than me, the calling. And so I'm ready for whatever comes my way with it. So the good, the challenges, and I'm really excited to think about those that might reject it initially, and then years later might revisit that.
Yeah, that's always exciting.
Yeah.
You brought up calling. One of the things I know for me, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I'm like, I have all these books in my head, and like, I feel called to share it. And if I don't write it, it's like it bubbles out of you. Like, you got to get it on paper and share it with somebody.
That's right.
It's
the only book I feel really called to write, really, my whole life, really.
All right.
I have felt called to write this book, and I might write more, but this is the one I've always wanted to share out of love to my sort of a love letter and an invitation to my evangelical Christian brothers and sisters.
Now, is this been like a lifelong calling? Did it kind of start when you had kids, when you reflected on your own childhood? Where did it?
I think a lifelong calling. I've always somehow been drawn to be an advocate for children. I'm very interested in child welfare. I'm very interested in social justice. That's what drew me into the helping profession, really, more than counseling, was looking at some of the injustices in the world. And I always had a burden for children that are disenfranchised or on the margins, children that don't have a voice. And I do see them as one of the most vulnerable populations in the world.
Yes.
And I'm fascinated that I don't know if you've read up on how many countries where it's illegal to spank a child, even to tap your hand. There's over 48 countries it's illegal. So in my dissertation research, I was fascinated by that, to learn that there are places in the world that do not allow this. And I don't think that'll ever happen in the US because of the Constitution. And there was one political leader that tried to ban spanking in California, and it was thrown out pretty quick.
Right.
So I think there'll always be that right to do that. But that makes me even more interested in the United States to bring up this conversation, especially in the Christian community.
One of the things that I'm passionate about, and I feel like I picked up on it in you as well when you were my professor, is there has to be people who are willing to call all of society to question whatever it is we're doing.
Yeah.
To just question it. You don't even, like I always tell clients, I care less about the what, much more about the why.
Yeah.
But we have to question, like, why are we doing this? Why? What's the price? What's the cost? What's the value? What's the return? And as we seek certainty more and more as a society, the questioners they're almost anathema to people, because it's very uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable.
And yet without the questioning, that scares me. That scares me. What does it mean if we stop questioning?
Right. It's the only way we grow, is that humility, that vulnerability is the only way we're going to grow. And that's why I want to invite even parents of adult children to reflect on ways that they may have made mistakes, and maybe apologizing to our adult children if you think that, because we all do. But not overdoing that, but really reflecting, being honest about that parenting is one of the hardest jobs, but one of the best, jobs, labor of love that I've adored. It's been my favorite role in my life. Yes. But reflecting on that and looking for all of us, and I ask myself the same thing I'm asking people to do. So I do appreciate that approach you take about asking those questions that promote critical thinking, making informed decisions. And I'm not going to be trying to convince anybody to follow
Right.
my view. It's more, I'll share my view and then say, what do you think? In the book. It's
Yes.
very much of a conversational type of book.
Yes, just invite the conversation. One of the things that I love to say about parenting, because I have found it true. I have 4 kids, 7 to 17. There's no greater endeavor that will invite you to regret than parenting.
Oh, so
Even
true.
if it turned out all right, you'll look back and think of 26 different ways you could have done it.
I know.
And at the same time, I agree with you 100%. I love being a dad. It is so much fun.
Oh, gosh, the best.
And terrifying all at the same time.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd want to tell to the listeners? Anything at all that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I want to encourage them to look at Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's work. She's a pediatrician and the Surgeon General for the state of California. She's done a lot of research about what she calls ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And she's looked at trauma, and she takes the view that corporal punishment and any kind of physical spanking for some children is traumatic, especially children with sensitive temperaments that are sensitive to stimuli. You see some autistic children, some children who have sensory sensitivity, and even resilient children, how it affects them to be struck by the person that's supposed to be the most trustworthy person in their life. So I want to encourage people to look at that research. She does come from a medical perspective, but I think in the evangelical world, we can benefit from learning from different disciplines in the medical field, in mental health, and to think critically about all of these social sciences and medical sciences from a Christian biblical worldview, and then live in the tension of looking for distortions, looking for the truth. And the goal really for me is to come closer to the mind and heart of God on any topic. And so I'm going to admit that I'm wrong anytime I think that it is not biblical or godly. But I'm opening up the question, how would God want us to raise our children? How would he want us to discipline our children? It's clear that he would want us to discipline our children. There's so many passages in scripture that talk about that. But how we do it, I think, is the question. I really think that's the main question I hope to get across. And I don't believe that the passages I've studied for my dissertation from the Bible, I do not believe they're promoting hitting a child. I believe they're promoting disciplining a child.
Right.
And sometimes we take that out of context. We put it in a literal frame. And I want to encourage people to revisit those passages. And as I interview Bible scholars, mostly Old Testament scholars, about the passages in Proverbs, about what did those mean? What did God intend by those statements? Because I'm a believer that the Bible is inerrant. It is the authority. And so I will forever be humble and reverent to that. And so how can we look at this? And many Bible scholars are saying that I'm interviewing, that it is not meant to promote this idea of hitting children. It never was meant to promote that. And that we perhaps have misinterpreted that. And sometimes we pass on what we've learned from our parents, from our pastors, and we might just pass them on. I'm just inviting people to think critically about it, make sure we're really understanding this well, and come together as a community for the conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I love there, you use the word discipline. I think because the English language is so vast and it has so many different words, we've melded some. And I think 2 words that we've melded is discipline and punishment.
Yes.
And punishment, it's punitive. That's the origin of the word. And discipline is training.
Yeah.
And for people to be able to, and then the other phrase that you use that I love is living in that tension. Because there are times, I'm in the thick of it. My oldest is 17, my youngest is 7, 14, and 15. There's times it's just, I know that what you did right here, I don't want you to do, but I'm not sure how to best respond. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to tell you that I don't want you to do it. And I'll let you know in 24 to 36 hours what's going to happen, because I need time to process it.
Yes.
Because I want to direct you, not because I want to punish you.
Yes. You're a good
and living in that tension. I hope so. Living in that tension.
Yeah,
All
and
right,
I
well,
talk about that in the book, the history of why we think of punishment when we think of discipline. And it really dates back to when you look at some of the laws about children as property and women as property.
yes,
And so the punitive model and the model of punishment has a strong history, but things have changed over the years with child welfare systems. Some countries still do not have child welfare. The United
Right.
States has a developed child welfare system. And so to start to think about the consequence model, so lots of books in social science that we've probably both read talk about more the consequence model, the teaching model.
right,
And we can start to pull away from the punitive model that was problematic for a lot of years, for a lot of centuries for folks, as we
right.
see children as human, as image bearers, and not seen as property to control. So there's a
Yes.
whole history I write about in the book of why that is and how we can transcend that as Christians to be
Right.
thoughtful parents with Christ-centered parenting.
So sometimes I re-engage my East Coast roots. And of course, I grew up in Pennsylvania, just a little bit north of Philly, where
Yeah.
we tend to get a little snarky. And sometimes when I'm sitting around a campfire having this conversation with friends, I'll say, the problem is kids aren't pets.
Yeah.
And often the parenting that I feel is being espoused by a lot of people, it's pet training.
Yeah.
And I don't even strike my pets. Like, that's not a good way to train pets.
Right.
I have a friend that's literally a shepherd, and he will say, because of course, spare the rod's full of child. He's like, you don't use the rod to beat the sheep.
Right.
You use the rod to redirect it one
Got
time.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Love it.
literally that's his profession.
Yeah.
People push back on him. And I'm just like, what are you doing?
Oh, wow.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Joe.
I really appreciate it.
Well, you were just one of the best students that I had, and it's great to see you as a colleague now. And thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so that was Catherine Mueller Bell. I hope you enjoyed that interview. Certainly a hot button topic. Just last night, I was scrolling through Instagram stories. I actually probably like Instagram a little bit better than Facebook because it's just pictures of people's lives. But I was scrolling through stories, and someone, I don't even remember who, but somebody put up, I think we can all agree that the get your ass beat generation produced better citizens than the timeout generation. And I was a little disappointed because the person who put it up, I didn't think had that point of view. And maybe some of you listening agree with it. I do not, as you probably picked up in the interview. I'm not a fan of timeouts though either. I think there are better ways to discipline. However, I hope you enjoyed the interview, and wherever you fall on the spectrum of how you utilize or don't utilize corporal punishment, I hope that this interview gives you room to stop and think, and I hope when the book comes out that you purchase it. As always, if you found value in this, please share it with your friends. I appreciate that so much. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend, and hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.